and I'm just here to introduce Liz, who is coming to us today from Safe Harbour to talk about understanding trauma reactions. So I'll just pass over to Liz and allow her to introduce herself.
Great. Thank you, Emma. And thanks to Safe Bay for having me. Thanks to the Youth Planning Committee. And thank you all for being here. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. We'll go ahead and get started. So let me share my screen. And get started with the slideshow. All right. Okay, so, and Emma, if you don't mind watching the chat and everything while we go through this, that would be great. Okay. So yes, welcome to Taking Care of Them, Taking Care of You, Understanding Typical Trauma Reactions and Coping as a Caregiver for a Survivor of Sexual Violence. So who am I and why am I talking about this? So as Emma said, my name is Liz Kazadi. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I live and work in Richmond, Virginia, at a nonprofit called Safe Harbor, and I've been there since April of 2017. We serve both adults and children who have been impacted by sexual and domestic violence and human trafficking, with services such as court advocacy, hospital advocacy, shelter, case management, and then counseling, which is what I do. So some of the stuff that I have done that pertains more to this topic is I've done I think just one at this point, a sexual violence support group at the University of Richmond. So working with young adults who have experienced sexual violence. I've run a few different support groups for adult male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And through that work, whether that's through the support group or working individually with those folks, we've had to talk a lot about, okay, not only healing from the abuse itself, but sometimes, okay, how would they have liked their family to have reacted differently? And then also just recently, this past fall, we saw a need. And so I created a support group for parents and caregivers of children who had been sexually abused, which went really well. And there continues to be a huge need for something like that. Quick disclaimer. So I myself am not a parent, so I'm not speaking from lived experience. I am speaking just from my professional experience working in this field. We only have about, 45, 50 minutes today to talk about this, and this is a pretty complicated subject. So, and I don't know who all is necessarily in this presentation, what your background is, what your situation is. Every person's experience is different and people may be at different points along their journey. So keep that in mind. Maybe just about everything that I'm talking about today. Maybe this stuff is brand new, but I hope just about everybody can get something helpful out of this presentation. So speaking of presentation, what are we going to talk about today? So going to give a quick overview of what is trauma, and then PTSD, talk about trauma in the brain and vicarious trauma as well, and then shift into, okay, how do we caretake for a child or adolescent who has either been sexually abused or sexually assaulted. And then what I would then like to focus on more possibly is, okay, how do you take care of yourself as a caregiver? So understanding your own experience and possibly getting help, and hopefully having some time for questions. And please do not forget about self-care throughout this presentation. This is kind of a heavy topic. So, if at any point anything is triggering to you, please take care of yourself, grab a drink of water, take a stretch, even log off if you need to. This is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube at some point. So if you need to check back in at a better time, do that. Okay. All right, so let's get going. Trauma. What is trauma? We talk so much about it these days, which is a great thing, but what is it really? It's a distressing event that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. And so it's important to know too that what is traumatic for one person may not be for the next. Like we might objectively think as something as traumatic, but depending on someone's biology, their support system, their coping skills and resilience, maybe it's not so traumatizing for them, but the person next to them may have an incredibly difficult time coping. So real quick, what are some examples of trauma? And you guys can either just shout it out or type it in the chat box. Yeah, abuse, neglect, and I've figured out Emma how to look at the chat box, so I've got that right now. Domestic violence, witnessing violence, yeah, that's a good point. Natural disasters. Yeah. Car accidents, war, divorce can be traumatizing, bullying, being diagnosed with an illness, being a caretaker for someone. Yeah, someone just brought up medical issues, surgeries. Trauma really runs the gamut, right? When we first started to understand trauma and PTSD, it really came out of, talking about shell shock, and the research really started getting going around the Vietnam War. But we've come to realize, yeah, trauma is pretty widespread and can take many different forms. And someone else just said, assault, feeling abandoned, feeling betrayed. Oh yeah, there's a whole thing called betrayal trauma, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. Poverty, racism, all those things can be traumatizing. Okay, so now that we have some ideas of what a traumatic event might be, what is PTSD? That also gets thrown out a lot. So we're looking at some specific symptoms. So re-experiencing symptoms, which might look like nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance. So avoiding either people, places, things, thoughts, emotions, even cognitive and emotional symptoms. So depression, anxiety are pretty common. Suicidality, self-harm, those might occur. Hyperarousal or reactivity symptoms, so panic attacks or always being on guard, a sense of hypervigilance or feeling jumpy. Those are kind of the big symptoms that make up PTSD. And I put onset here because PTSD might come on immediately after an event, or it could take days, weeks, years for it to kind of crop up and show, and it is just as valid no matter when it starts. So trauma, PTSD, well, what is vicarious trauma? So it's an indirect exposure to trauma and its subsequent symptoms. Typically in the research, it's used to describe helpers. So therapists like myself or medical, EMS personnel, police officers, emergency responders, those kinds of folks. There's a lot of research around those occupations and vicarious trauma, but we can also, okay, let's also kind of think of helpers as being parents or caregivers of people who are either experiencing violence or experiencing a medical diagnosis. It can also manifest in that way. So we're gonna talk real quick about trauma in the brain. I think this is really important to understand. So here you have a picture, but you can also look at me if you would like, and I see some things coming up in the chat. And yeah, we're gonna talk about numbing, and we'll get to that in a second. So you guys can look at me or you can look at the picture, it's up to you. But we're gonna pretend my hand here is the brain, okay? And if we pretend my hand is the brain, we're gonna think of the wrist and the forearm as being the brain stem. So back here, this is what develops first, in the womb and kind of throughout. It's the most ancient part of the brain, most primitive and critical functioning. So like heart rate, breathing, those kinds of things you absolutely need to live. Then as we kind of move through into the midbrain, we get into our palm here. And lots of stuff going on here, but we're going to focus on the limbic system, which is sort of the emotional system. And at the center of that, we've got my thumb, the amygdala. The amygdala controls a few things, but we're going to focus on the fear response. So that develops next, again, not only in the womb, but also sort of throughout life, as parts of the brain come online. Finally, my 4 fingers here, we've got the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex right behind the forehead. That's the last thing to develop, and that's where all of our executive functioning lives. So planning, impulse control, logic and rationale, language. And now researchers are saying, that our brains aren't even really fully developed until about age 25. So this is the last thing to really solidify and come online. So the way trauma and PTSD works is, let's say you're walking in the woods, you hear a snap, you turn around and you see this bear and it's growling at you and it's, ready to attack you. Your amygdala gets activated and says, oh crap, we're in trouble. And it might do one of a few things, sometimes a combination, but let's say it says, oh crap, we're in trouble. Let's fight this bear. May or may not be the smartest thing to do, but you don't really have a whole lot of logical conscious choice in this matter anymore. Your frontal lobe is offline, your amygdala is in control, and it's just trying to survive. So it says, let's fight this bear. Or you turn around, see this bear, oh crap, we're in trouble. Let's get out of here. Let's run away. Again, may or may not be the smartest thing to do. Bears are incredibly fast, but you don't remember that Nat Geo episode, right? You're just trying to survive. Or you turn around, you see that bear, oh crap, we're in trouble. And your amygdala says, shut it down. Don't move, don't speak. Even if your frontal lobe wants to, it is no longer in control. Your amygdala runs the show right now. So we've got fight, flight, or freeze. And let's say whatever you do, you survive that situation, right? And then maybe a few months later, you're walking downtown in a city with friends, right? And logically, there shouldn't be any bears around. But this traumatic experience is imprinted essentially on your brain, and your brain is, ready to protect you at any moment. And so you hear a snap similar to that snap you heard before you saw that bear. So you get triggered and your amygdala says, oh crap, we must be in trouble again. And you're ready to punch someone, run away, or you shut down. Something else that can happen during fight, flight, or freeze, but especially during freeze, is called dissociation. Some of you may be familiar with it, but so during the event itself, people might describe it as having like an out of body experience, like they're watching it happen to someone else, because your brain says like, this is too much to take. We're going to let the body endure whatever is about to happen, and we're going to send the mind somewhere else because it's too much. And so the way PTSD works, right? So either, you get triggered, you're back in fight, flight, freeze mode, survival mode. Dissociation can also occur when those things are triggered. So let's say you freeze, you shut down. But the way it might look is your body is on autopilot. You're nodding, you're walking, yep. But you're not really there. You're not really present. You might have like a numb, tingly, floaty, disconnected sensation. So dissociation kind of helps explain, part of what helps explain why people have such a hard time remembering traumatic events, or it gets very disjointed. Also, I don't think we talk, and most people know about fight and flight. We don't talk enough about freeze. And in fact, that's what happens a lot during sexual violence, especially when we're talking about, let's say the victim is female, the perpetrator is male. So, we're talking different body sizes and body types, or if the victim is a child and it's someone older, freeze can be kind of the go-to reaction. And that's also where a lot of guilt and shame might arise from. Like, why didn't I do something? Why didn't I yell? Why didn't I fight back? Because you were just trying to survive, right? Your amygdala was in control and it got you through. So got your trauma in the brain here. We're going to come back to why I point out sort of how it develops going forward. Okay. There we go. All right. So Ang brought up, okay, what about numbing? So hopefully you can see part of this, but this was prepared by Rick Goodman from Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery, which is an excellent book. But the hangover of trauma. So I show a lot of my clients this and they're like, yep, this is wow, this is my life on a piece of paper. So you see the traumatic event itself, the hyperarousal, the permanent alert, and then you can see just how many areas, like pretty much permeates one's life. It affects every different part of it, right? Sexual violence doesn't just affect someone in terms of their sexuality or their intimacy, but the way they think, feel, act, their relationships with other people. And oftentimes, right, it's this polarization happens, constriction versus intrusion. And at the bottom, you can see too that there are a lot of body effects that happen. So just a few I want to point out are emotionally. So, you know, for people who are not trauma informed, which may often include the justice system, you know, oh, they must not have been raped. They should be hysterical, right? Why aren't they crying? Why aren't they upset? Well, because that's not how everybody reacts. So might either be numbed out, you know, kind of shut down, or flooded. So feeling everything to the nth degree. And people can move, you know, along this spectrum. Intimacy and sexuality. Again, I think people tend to think, oh, they've been assaulted. They must, you know, or they might expect someone to sort of shut down or be totally closed off or have a really hard time with that. And that may be true, or they actually may become promiscuous or hypersexual. And that is a totally normal and common response, and no one should feel shame about that. Both reactions, all reactions, are in regards to control. You know, no one's going to touch my body, or I am actively deciding who I am having sex with. Behaviorally, so again, I think we tend to think about people who have been traumatized as, oh, they're going to act out, they're going to have tons of problems. May happen on one end, or so we got this idea of the problem child, but people tend to look over the perfectionist, the person who is doing everything they can to make everything okay. If I can make everything else okay, maybe this will be okay too. Or I don't want anybody to know, so I'm gonna give 110%. And a lot of times we might look that person over. I like to think of PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, as a developmental disorder. So not only does it affect all areas of life, but it often affects it across the lifespan. So that's not to say that people can't heal from trauma. They can. Recovery is possible. I absolutely believe that. But it may manifest in different ways, especially if that trauma occurs in childhood, in different stages along life. So if you're not familiar, we've got the ACEs study, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, groundbreaking, still ongoing, started in the 90s by Kaiser Permanente, really looking at, okay, let's kind of do a longitudinal study looking at different traumatic experiences and how that might affect health outcomes later in life. And so in a nutshell, what they found was people who had multiple traumatic experiences, and the more that you had, such as experiencing racism, poverty, sexual abuse, divorce, incarcerated parent, mental illness in the family. There are several. The more ACEs you had, the more likely you were to have health problems later in life. So not only, okay, your own mental health issues or even substance abuse, but heart disease, obesity, depression. So, it was fairly predictive of what someone's health outcomes, not just mental health, but physical health as well. And thinking too about, so if you use Erickson's model of development, this idea that we sort of resolve issues at every stage of life. So if we think of resolving trauma as either a child or an adolescent in that one stage, okay, great. Doesn't mean that it's not maybe gonna come back up at a later stage in life. So for example, let's say a 12-year-old deals with sexual violence, goes to therapy, does really well, and is back to pre-trauma functioning more or less. But as this person gets older, and natural development, perhaps, seeking out romantic or dating sexual partners, they may have some issues that crop up around that, things that hadn't even been an issue before, or even thought of, right? And then let's say, but maybe they get back into therapy, they resolve that then. Also super common is for people who become parents who had their own traumas as kids, especially childhood sexual abuse that maybe either they never dealt with or kind of set aside, or even if they did deal with it, when they either have a child or that child reaches the same age they were when they were abused, things can kind of come back up. So definitely thinking of it as sort of a chronic condition, if that makes sense. Okay. And then also, a lot of times when I talk to my clients about this, okay, well, what's the trauma? Okay, oh, they're acting out, they're having a hard time in school. And what's being a teenager? Adolescence without any, violence, any other, ACEs, maybe fairly traumatizing on its own. Being a teenager is hard. You got all this flood of hormones trying to fit in. High school can be hell. So, even kids without dealing with this may be having a hard time, maybe kind of on that up and down roller coaster. And so for parents, it's like, well, what's the trauma and what's being a teenager? What's normal? What's not? How do I deal with this? And I think a lot of times you can kind of use the same techniques without necessarily knowing the source. So getting into taking care of them. What does that mean? First, educating yourself not only on trauma, but understanding normal childhood development. So knowing what is normal for the most part at every stage. For example, understanding what normal masturbation looks like. I think people would be surprised to find out that kind of masturbation starts a lot earlier than we think it does. That a child may accidentally bump their genitals up against something and say, "Ooh, that feels pretty good." And then that kind of goes away for a while. We have this latent period before puberty happens, and then things kind of ramp back up again. So understanding that, yeah, masturbation is normal. However, it's something that is done in private. We might want to look at something if, masturbation is done sort of starting to happen in public, or even if there's maybe some exploratory stuff with other kids. Okay, if they're, the same age, like, hey, this is what I got, what do you got? But if there's an age gap between those kids, that could be problematic. Also, if children are starting to masturbate to self-soothe, even to the point of self-injury or self-harm, or becoming obsessive, then yeah, that's problematic. That's not necessarily normal. So really understand, that's just one example of kind of thinking about, okay, what is normal, what's not normal in terms of childhood development. So sexually, but also, okay, yeah, that kids are going to try to individuate themselves, kind of explore their own identity. They might dye their hair. That's fairly normal for teenagers, not necessarily a function of a trauma reaction. So using a top down versus bottom up approach. So on that hangover of trauma sheet, you saw that at the bottom, there were these body effects. And if we think about the brain again, so if we think bottom up, top down, children and adolescents' brains are still developing. And especially if they've been traumatized, they might, or if they're really upset, their brains might be like this more than they're like this. And as adults, we might, try to reason, try to talk to them. But if they're here, they can't hear you. So instead of reasoning or talking things through, it may be much more effective to relate to them on this physical level. So, and I didn't write it down here, but like co-regulation. So making sure you yourself are calm, and if your kid is really freaked out for whatever reason, okay, is your breathing in check? Doing some really audible breathing so they can clue into that, hopefully slow down their own breathing. If it's okay, putting a hand on them, letting that oxytocin release. Just being that calm presence, relating to them on that level versus this higher brain level. Because a lot of trauma is stored in the body, and especially, like I said, for kids and for teenagers, it may be far easier to communicate and relate on this lower body level versus this high logic language level. If you think about the way we relate to babies, right? Babies don't know what we're saying, what the words mean necessarily, but they understand tone. They understand, our facial expression. They can feel, they can sense tension and relaxation. And so being mindful of the way we're approaching someone in that way. Safety. Safety is huge. Establishing that safety for your child. So unconditional positive regard. Yes, your kid still needs boundaries and consequences, but they need to know that you've got their back no matter what. I didn't write it down because I think it goes without saying, but believing your child about the trauma that they've experienced, supporting them, avoiding guilting and shaming, of course. And then boundaries, that their boundaries through this trauma have been crossed. So respecting your kids' boundaries, practicing consent in the household, and also holding your own boundaries. Yes, your child has been through something terrible. That doesn't mean that the rules just go away all of a sudden. In fact, predictable, consistent rules and consequences can actually help to establish a sense of safety. They may not like it in the moment, but it tells them that, okay, my parent has this under control. They're going to be consistent. They're going to follow up on this. Okay. And then finally, if you're familiar, this pyramid over here, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which basically says that we as human beings have certain needs and there's a priority to them. So the first one's physiological needs, the things we just need to survive, right? So food, water, warmth, rest, like biologically, those are the things we need to be alive. Then we have safety. And then we get into some of these higher things, the psychological needs and self-fulfillment needs. One of the best things you can do is pay attention to those biological needs, that things like anxiety and depression attack our self-care skills. Eating too much, not eating at all. Sleeping too much, not sleeping at all. And things kind of start to fall apart after that. So, if your kid is having a hard time, helping them regulate and, create a routine around eating and sleeping and getting homework done, getting rest, doing what they need to do for that. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a second. But sometimes just starting with the basics can be super helpful. And then promoting resiliency. So, facilitating social support. I myself experienced a trauma as a teenager. And one of the best things my dad could have done for me was the very next day I had soccer practice. He's like, yeah, you're going to go to soccer practice. We're going to, have some sense of normalcy here. And man, just to be with my friends and being with my coach who, I loved and supported me. They didn't know what was going on. But to get out there, run around, be with my people was hugely impactful. So ensuring safety, but avoiding overprotection, which is incredibly difficult when probably the worst thing you could have imagined just happened. And you're not always going to get it right, but trying to walk that line because overprotection itself can be damaging. After trauma, you need to get back your sense of self, your sense of self-efficacy. And that's so much about what growing up is about, to try things out, to fail to some degree and to learn and grow from that. And so, yes, protecting, but still letting them be a kid and do some normal stuff. And absolutely understanding that recovery is not linear, just the same way that the onset of PTSD, varies from person to person. Everybody's recovery is unique, and it is certainly not a straight line up. It's more like a squiggle line across the graph. There are going to be some good days and some bad days and some setbacks. And when it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that's okay. That's normal. Keep going. And then finally, one of the best things that you can do to help take care of a child who has experienced a trauma is to actually take care of yourself. So what does that mean? So we're dealing with vicarious trauma. So seeing someone you love go through something terrible, that's traumatic. But also just hearing that news, experiencing that is sort of your own trauma. So you're kind of experiencing your kid's trauma, your own trauma, and dealing with that. Not to mention, should that bring up any of your own past traumas that you've also previously dealt with. So you got a lot going on in dealing with this. And then this idea of institutional betrayal. So Dr. Jennifer Freyd came up with this idea of betrayal trauma, or at least gave a word to it, an institutional betrayal that, okay, unfortunately, a lot of people, a lot of families who deal with this not only are dealing with the trauma of the abuse or the assault itself, but then all these subsequent traumas. So reporting it to the police, having to go through that whole process, perhaps going through the justice system, which may or may not be helpful or just or fair even. And so navigating yourself through these various systems, you may actually experience further traumas. I think I was able to catch a little bit of Georgie Palafox's presentation on Friday about her experience with her daughter, and that, even professionals that are supposed to help, who are in my role, may be traumatizing. So not only dealing with this initial trauma, but then everything else that unfortunately may come with that. And I think, again, that intersectionality of parenthood. So that's kind of what I was referring to, and that you're dealing with your trauma, your past trauma, and your kids' trauma right now, and trying to figure out a way forward. And with that, there might be a lot of feelings that come up around your role as a parent, your identity, and self-esteem. Might have feelings of guilt, shame, fear, anger, feelings like, I didn't protect my kid. Why did this happen? Am I a bad parent? Justified fear, and certainly justified anger. I'm sure a number of people or institutions. And so that's why self-care for the caregiver is so important. So hopefully you can see me, but I want to talk a little bit about the window of tolerance. So let's say everything in this window in between my hands here is what you can handle, right? So if you've been eating well enough for what's typical for you, getting your typical amount of sleep, kind of on top of schoolwork, bills, whatever it is, and your relationships are okay. You've been doing your laundry, whatever. Your self-care is going well. Your window might be here. If you haven't been sleeping well lately, maybe you've been eating a lot of junk food or food that doesn't make you feel good. And work has been super stressful lately. Your window is here. And let's say you get a flat tire. You're driving, it's raining, and you get a flat tire. It's like the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Boom, your window is closed, and you either go up over that window, so that hyperarousal, maybe fight or flight response, where you might be having a panic attack on the side of the road, you might be screaming, crying, maybe you're kicking your car, I don't know. Or you go down below that window, and that looks like freeze. You shut down, maybe start to isolate, feeling depressed, that kind of thing, right? However, if your window of tolerance is open, okay, still stressful, still takes you down a notch, but you still have all this capacity to deal. So, okay, I'm going to call AAA. I don't have AAA, I'm going to call a friend, or I'm going to change it myself, right? I can still kind of think and figure out my way through this. So it's so important for yourself, pay attention to those those basic needs to keep that window of tolerance open. Especially, so we can't necessarily predict flat tires or spilled coffee on ourselves. But we do know when a test is coming up, or a big meeting at work, or a difficult conversation, or if you got court, or I tell my clients all the time, sometimes you got to practice self-care around therapy. We might be talking about something difficult today. How am I going to increase my window? What am I going to do beforehand? What am I going to do during to keep myself in this window? And what am I going to do after to get myself back to baseline? This always reminds me of the Snickers commercials. You're not yourself when you're hungry. That's real, right? Hunger is a real thing. I am super cranky when I'm tired. Self-care is all about checking in with yourself. Am I really angry at this person, or am I just hungry? What do I need right now? In fact, I need some water. So eating, sleeping, moving your body, and that self-care is not selfish. taking care of you, in fact, takes care of everyone else around you. Because let's say you have a toddler and your toddler spills, fruit punch on white carpet or a white couch. How much better are you going to respond to that toddler, and be understanding and work through it together if your window of tolerance is here, if you have taken care of yourself, versus if your window of tolerance is here. I get it. Life is hard. There's a lot going on. So it's not going to be perfect, just like recovery is not linear. We have good self-care days and we have bad self-care days. And self-care doesn't necessarily mean doing it all on your own, but, seeking out community care. Okay. Not only for your own benefit, because you are going through a lot, but that you'll be a better friend, a better parent to your child. Okay. We don't have necessarily time to talk about self-care examples, so I'm going to move on. And finally, getting help for yourself. There's and rightfully so much attention on the child who has just experienced this terrible thing. Got to get them help. Again, not only but you too are going through a lot of trauma right now. So getting yourself help for you, just for you, but also that'll help you be a better parent to your child through this time, and probably beyond that as well. Again, referencing Georgie from Friday, she mentioned how, like, in Arizona, there weren't really a whole lot of resources, which may be the case for any person, whether it's their state doesn't have a lot of resources, or maybe you're in a more rural area. And I think someone asked previously in the chat about, like, my support group. So for the most part, support groups that are run by mental health professionals are only going to be sort of within state lines. We can't often cross state boundaries in providing mental health help. But one of the upsides of this pandemic is it has sort of normalized telehealth, and that insurances are covering that at the moment. So even if there's not something in your area, so to speak, you might be able to find something within your state. And the internet is both great and terrible, but one of the great things is being able to connect with others on issues like this. Because something I found with the parents that I worked with back in the fall is, like, who are you going to talk to about this? It can feel very isolating as a parent to be going through this and feel like you don't have any support, or that there's so many misunderstandings. We talk about victim blaming. There might be parent blaming going on. And so individual counseling can be super helpful, but also group therapy gives you something that individual can't. That connection, that support, feeling like there is someone there that is going through the same thing that you are, and that you're not alone, and that you can share different coping strategies and check in with each other and talk to someone in a way that you can't necessarily talk to anybody else. So definitely encouraging parents to get that help in any way they can, even if it's starting, an informal support group themselves. So yep, individual therapy, group therapy. And then, a lot of folks then do find healing through their own advocacy, advocating on behalf of victims or survivors, or, on behalf of families and other parents, perhaps, advocating for more resources around these issues. Okay, so I think we have just a few minutes for questions, if anybody has them. So you're in Massachusetts, how can you find support groups? A good place to start is NAMI, N-A-M-I, what is it? National, I can't even think about what it stands for, but mental health organization. They often have support groups or have a list of them. Another good national, so like Safe Harbor, we are just ourselves here in Richmond, but a good national organization that has several branches throughout the United States is the YWCA, who typically serve survivors of sexual and domestic violence. So so the hangover of trauma is actually from this report. I can't even think of it, but it was called Men in Healing, and I think it was actually out of Australia. But the book that it's based off of is Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. I'll put that in there. Oh, I think I just sent it to Emma let me make sure I'm not sending direct message. So we've got NAMI, YWCA, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. And then another really great book to understand trauma is The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Those are excellent reads. Also practice self-care as you're reading these things too, because they can be kind of heavy. Another one specifically for male survivors, and this is really geared towards adult male survivors of childhood sexual abuse, but just throwing it out there, is also Victims No More by Mike Liu. And he even talks in his book about having support groups for partners of people who've experienced sexual violence. So if this applies to you, use that resource as well. Priya said this can apply to other forms of trauma. As far as, I guess, when you say this, what exactly are you referring to? Are you talking about the books I mentioned, or just some clarification? And you can hop on the mic if you want, Priya, or you can type it in. Oh, presentation? Yeah, absolutely. I think it can definitely apply to different forms of trauma. I mean, the one that comes to mind is like chronic medical issues or illnesses for both the person experiencing those as well as the caretaker. Super important that everyone's getting support through that. Helpful all around.
Thank you so much, Liz. It looks like that's all the questions for the moment. If there are any more, then we can certainly take those and pass them over to you if you're happy to do that.
Sure.
But yeah, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Your presentation was really great, and I think what you say about it being such heavy content, it didn't, for me personally, it didn't feel too heavy. You know, it was still really interesting and enjoyable. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here and asking your questions.